Bill Gates and George Soros just updated their portfolios. I'll take you through the buys and the sells in each of their portfolios. So we just got the 13F update just earlier this week, and that is basically a requirement for these asset managers to report their holdings. So for Bill Gates here, he increased his Microsoft holdings by 4,000%. So massive jump there. And then Berkshire Hathaway, he increased his holdings by 27% over the past quarter. And then in Canadian National Railway, he increased his holdings by 433%, so 4xing his holdings. And then for Waste Management here, he increased his holdings percent, so massive jumps around the board. Definitely notable to see that Bill Gates is increasing his exposure within these companies. And with that being said, let's take a look at Bill Gates' historical performance. So over the past 10 years, he has performed at 157%, which is actually above some notable investors such as Cathie Wood and a couple others. So it is interesting to see that he has been outperforming. And then in this quarter, just to be clear, he did more buying than selling. So overall, a net bullish move going into this quarter for Bill Gates. George Soros made some interesting moves over the past quarter as well. We'll go through those. So he had sold pretty much entirely out of his investment bond ETF, investment grade bond ETF. He initiated positions in Activision Blizzard, Novo. He initiated a holding there. And really what I'll do here is I'll just go over the changes in his holdings that make up a significant amount of his portfolio because there's a ton of changes here. So we also saw him sell out of his Rivian stake. Also, he increased his holdings in Area Cap Holdings, bought more of that. And then Denbury, he increased his holdings there. I believe Exxon just had bought that company, if I'm not mistaken. And then Armac, he sold out of. He bought into the Russell, which I thought was pretty interesting. So this is a new holding for him. He bought into the Russell 2000 ETF. And then Vulcan Materials, he sold out of. He also bought into a 20-year Treasury bond ETF. And then 5.9 he bought into. Let's see some more. And then CBOE Global Markets, he increased his holdings by 26%. So definitely some interesting moves here. Sold down his Intuit holdings. He also increased exposure to a China emerging markets ETF, so bullish on China. And then he also added to, he actually initiated a position in Taiwan Semiconductor, also initiated a position in Apple. And then Broadcom's a new holding. Datadog's a new holding for him. Sempra, new holding. These are all kind of smaller holdings here. So he also sold out of his Disney holdings, which I thought was pretty interesting. DoorDash, he increased his holdings by 30% there. And then a Chinese ETF, he increased his shares by 9%. So it seems like he's increasing exposure to China. Also sold out of rocket companies. So I think that's enough of that. Let's take a look at some of the interesting options positions he's been buying and selling over this past quarter. So he owns 53 options right now. And he increased exposure to actually puts on the triple Qs. So it seems like he's positioning for somewhat of a bearish move lower for the broader NASDAQ sector. And then he also increased exposure to BlackRock 20-year Treasury bond ETF. He bought some calls there. And then he bought some puts on the Russell, probably offsetting his large share position there, so nothing crazy to note there. And then he sold out of some calls for Splunk. He increased options for Alibaba, so once again here, that China trend. He's going bullish on China. That's pretty clear. And then bought some puts on Apple as well. Bought some calls on utilities ETF, Cloudflare. He bought some calls. He bought calls and puts on Cloudflare, but more calls than puts, so net bullish there. And then PDD Holdings, which is a Chinese firm, he sold down those calls a bit, likely taking profits as that company has been outperforming. One thing I thought was very interesting is he bought into calls and puts in MicroStrategy. All that really is it's basically a bet that volatility will continue to be high. So one of those trades will kind of offset the losses in the other if volatility is high. So honestly, kind of an interesting trade. Makes sense, right? Crypto has been so volatile. I think that's actually a pretty good trade for him. And then 5-9, he sold out, or excuse me, he sold down his puts. Wayfair, he increased his options in Wayfair puts by 150%. Capri Holding, he bought some calls there. Unity Software, he increased his calls by 250%. He also he sold down his ARK Innovation ETF calls. And then we could see that Snap, he increased his holdings in those calls there. And he'd also added to some GM puts, some General Motor puts. It's a new position for him. Kind of goes into a larger theme that we saw with Warren Buffett, who actually sold completely out of his GM stake. So seems like notable investors are kind of running from GM here. And then B. Riley Financial, he sold about 30% of those options. Nordstrom, just initiated an option position there. And then Lyft, he bought some puts in that one. Nordstrom, he also bought puts, so likely just trying to profit off of volatility, as I had kind of said before, with a different position. And then Fastly, which is a software company, he added to some calls there. And then Dish Networks, he sold about 7% of his calls in that one as well. So all very interesting to see. And we can take a peek at his long-term performance. So his 10-year performance is actually negative. He's been minus 40% over the past 10 years. So Bill Gates has been kind of drastically outperforming it, which is kind of funny because Soros is more in the financial space. He's a Wall Street guy. So it's kind of funny to see Bill Gates outperforming someone who's worked in the industry and has kind of been a vet of Wall Street. So interesting to see that Bill Gates has been the more reliable investor, funny enough. So with that being said, a lot to take away from this. Kind of the main takeaways, just to kind of wrap a bow on this, is George Soros is increasing his exposure to Chinese companies. That was a big theme that I saw here. And he's also, I would call it a net bear, because there were a lot of puts sprinkled in there. I think he's more betting on a lot of volatility in names like MicroStrategy and a couple others. But kind of the number one takeaway would be that he increased his exposure to Chinese companies pretty significantly over the past quarter. So, thought that was pretty interesting. But with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. Helps out the channel a bunch. And I'll see you here next time.